Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to extend a warm welcome to the webinar, Rethinking Disaster Mitigation and Preparedness, held as part of the webinar series, Capacity Building for Disaster Risk Management of Cultural Heritage, Challenges and Opportunities in Post-COVID Times. This webinar series is organized by the Institute of Disaster Mitigation for Urban Cultural Heritage at Ritsumeikan University, Kyoto, Japan, nicknamed as RDMUCH, and ICROM, the International Center for the Study of Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property, which is an intergovernmental organization working in the service of its 137 member states, and is promoting conservation of all forms of cultural heritage in every region of the world. Since Ritsumeikan University was accredited as a UNESCO chair program in cultural heritage and risk management in 2006, we have been organizing an international training course, ITC, on disaster risk management of cultural heritage every year. Besides various research activities to advance and disseminate knowledge on reducing disaster risks, as well as preparing, responding and recovering from them following disasters caused by natural and human-induced hazards such as earthquakes, floods, typhoons, cyclones, fires, etc. So let me just share the screen. Let me just get to the screen now. Yes. So the COVID-19 pandemic, as we are all experiencing right now, has caused unprecedented health crisis and global disruption, which is making us think how to manage disasters caused by biological hazards. Besides huge impact on people's lives and livelihoods, this pandemic has also impacted heritage sites and cultural institutions, as well as intangible cultural heritage. Many heritage sites and cultural institutions, such as museums and libraries, have been shut down due to lockdowns. According to the data collected by UNESCO World Heritage Center, almost 90% of the World Heritage properties have been closed in many days in April and May. And while the pandemic is on, we are also facing other kind of disasters, such as earthquake in Croatia or cyclone in India and Bangladesh just last month. The pandemic has caused a huge challenge in maintaining and monitoring these heritage sites and cultural institutions, also affecting tourism revenues and livelihoods of the people who are directly or indirectly depending on them. Moreover, many craft persons and building artisans have lost their jobs, while festivals and cultural practices have been disrupted, thereby affecting intangible heritage. At the same time, invaluable role of cultural heritage in providing psychosocial support to the communities have also been brought forward in this pandemic. Bringing forward innovative practices in monitoring and communication using digital technology. So this is the kind of unprecedented situation we are in right now, where we have pandemic situation which is combining together with conflict and disasters. And research is also indicating that the causes for these increased intensity and frequency is very much connected of epidemics such as the one we are facing right now, is also connected to climate change, rapid urbanization, and the increasing global mobility, which is really affecting the kind of rapid spread of this pandemic. There is actually already enough evidence to indicate that the importance of traditional knowledge is really there in planning and management, which can provide us with healthier living environment. So cultural heritage is not just for us to protect, but actually there's a lot of knowledge or lessons that we can learn so that we can prevent such pandemics in the future. So on one hand, we need to think about reducing vulnerability and risk to cultural heritage due to disasters. caused by biological hazards and others, and also improving local capacities. On the other hand, we also need to reconfigure response and recovery as we pass through this crisis and emerge from it. So, if we look at all the aspects of disaster risk management, we have to now relook at them from the lens of COVID 19. Clearly, there are lessons to be learned from this pandemic, and that cuts across all aspects of disaster risk assessment and cultural heritage management. So, as we move towards post COVID time, it is time for us to reflect on how we should continue capacity building in disaster risk management of cultural heritage by tailoring existing knowledge and skills, identifying and filling gaps in terms of knowledge areas, target audiences, and pedagogy based on the lessons learned from this pandemic. The webinar series of UNESCO Chair Program on Cultural Heritage and Risk Management by RDMUCH at Ritsumeikan University and ICROM aims to discuss future directions of cultural heritage management uh, and managing disasters for through these presentations. How do we turn this new normal into new opportunity? And the first part of this series is focused on rethinking disaster mitigation and preparedness. So now I will pass the floor to Dr. Dovon Kim, Associate Professor at Ritsumeikan University. So over to you, Dovon. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. Before starting my speech, let me sharing my the PowerPoint. Okay, a thematic meeting on cultural heritage risk management was held in Kobe, Japan in January 2005 as part of the United Nations World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, or WCDR. This was the first time a meeting focused on cultural heritage was held in a global event on disaster risk management. The meeting adopted a declaration that recognized the close relationship between cultural heritage protection and socio-economic development and extreme challenges confronted due to increasing frequency and intensity of disasters. In response to the recommendations of the conference, our DMUCH has been acting as a focal point for organizing international research, training, and networking in the field of disaster risk management related to cultural heritage. As a result, Ritsumeikan University, in collaboration with ICROM, established the International Training Course on Disaster Risk Management of Cultural Heritage in 2006 and has been organizing this annual course nicknamed as ITC every year as part of the UNESCO Chair Program. This training course has focused on various topics that reflect international needs and interests in this vast field. During the last 2 years, we have specially focused on integrated protection of immovable and movable cultural heritage from disasters. Annually, the number of the applicants is increasing, and we had 280 applicants on last year. The past training courses has been attended by 152 participants in total from 62 countries. During these courses, the trainees have depended and understanding of not only various aspects of disaster risk management of cultural heritage in Japan, but also various challenges, opportunities, and lessons from international researches and practice in this field of cultural heritage conservation and the disaster risk management. All the lectures, site visits, exercises, and workshops are performed by the distinguished professionals and researchers from around the world. The participants who are drawn from cultural heritage and disaster risk management fields work in multidisciplinary teams to learn the principles and practical know-how for balancing disaster risk management measures with those needed for conserving the values of cultural heritage. This will help towards reducing disaster risks to cultural heritage by taking into consideration and typology of cultural heritage, the type of hazards to which they are exposed, and the social, economic, and institutional context of the participants. As we move towards post-COVID times, it is time for us to reflect on how we should continue capacity building on the disaster risk management of cultural heritage based on learnings from this pandemic. So we are indeed privileged to be joined by a multidisciplinary group of panelists who are the key resource persons of our international training course, and I'm very much delighted to introduce them to you. Okay, may I request all the panelists to kindly turn on your camera for our audience to see them. Professor Takeyuki Okubo. Okay. Please welcome Dr. Ksenia Chumutina and Professor Lee Bosher from Loughborough University, UK. Okay, Professor Takeyuki Okubo and Professor Yoshifumi Satofuka from Ritsumeikan University, and Mr. Joseph King from ICROM. Before I proceed further, may I apprise you of some procedures for housekeeping during this webinar. You can send your queries and comments via Q&A icon that you see at the bottom of the Zoom window. We will take up some questions after the presentations by our panelists in case we are unable to answer all the questions due to shortage of time. Please do send us an email and we will surely get back to you. So let me have this privilege in firstly inviting Dr. Ksenia Chumutina and Professor Lee Bosher from Loughborough University. Dr. Ksenia Chumutina is a senior lecturer in sustainable and resilient urbanism at the School of Architecture, Building, and Civil Engineering at Loughborough University. Her main research interests are in understanding of the processes of disaster risk creation and in synergies and tensions of resilience and sustainability in the built environment. And Dr. Lee Bosher is Professor of Disaster Risk Management and Director of doctoral programs in the School of Architecture, Building, and Civil Engineering at Loughborough University. His main research interests are the multidisciplinary integration of proactive hazard mitigation strategies into the decision-making processes of key stakeholders involved with the planning, design, construction, and operation of the building environment. They will set the stage for this webinar through their introductory presentation on considering multiple risks and inequalities in COVID-19 times. Over to you, Ksenia and Lee.
Thank you, Doan. Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Lee and I are absolutely delighted to join you all today. And as some of you know, those of you who joined the ITC courses before, you know that our role usually on the course is to highlight the importance of considering multi-hazard approaches and also to really make the participants think about the vulnerabilities that turn hazards into disasters. And today we will reflect on this in the context of COVID-19.
Thank you, Ksenia. Yeah, so I know these webinars have a COVID-19 focus, which is highly relevant under the current circumstances, but we wanted to take this opportunity to just sort of maybe request people to take a little bit of a step back when it comes to dealing with COVID-19 related issues generally, but also specifically when it comes to cultural heritage. So as we see here, this is a typical sort of risk management matrix with likelihood aligned against consequences. I suspect the concern is that in the past, when big events such as pandemics and large tsunamis, which might be termed the black swan events, occur, because they're rare but very high impact. Other examples can be large volcanic eruptions, for example. So these are events which are quite rare or unlikely, but can have major or severe consequences. And I think when those events happen, there can be a sort of a propensity for people to sort of perhaps overly focus on those high impact events. Contrary to that, there's also what might be called white swan events. So these are frequent but apparently low impact events. And I say apparently, I'll explain that in a moment. But these are things like floods, or maybe changes in weather patterns which are leading to droughts, or an increase in storminess, or increase in fires in natural environments, for example, landslides and mass crowd movements, which are quite common, but the consequences are deemed to be insignificant. So one of our first pleas is to perhaps rethink if those consequences are insignificant, are they insignificant? Because it might be that they're minor or moderate consequences for many people, but actually for some people or some types of buildings or some types of cultural heritage, they could be major or severe, which is the next click, Ksenia. It's working. Yeah, so expect just to reframe a little bit whether the so-called low impact events are actually low impact for who. They might be quite major impacts for some types of people, some sections of society. So in understanding that, we need to better understand the underlying vulnerabilities, and they can be social, political, physical, environmental and economic.
So what we've seen recently is that COVID has been portrayed as a non-discriminatory event. But actually, in reality, the virus disproportionately impacts the most vulnerable sections of society that do not have the safety nets that the wealthiest sections of society have. So we know that there are more, different people from different categories are more likely to die because of COVID-19. And these are not only people who are older, but also people, the Black people and people of color, people with disabilities and underlying health conditions, as well as homeless people. These are the people who do not have access to social safety nets, particularly in the countries without social support services. And these are also the people who do not have free access to healthcare provisions in most countries. And we also need to consider livelihood. So the evidence so far suggests that people who cannot work from home, so for example, nurses and doctors, people who need to physically attend work, such as manual laborers and other key workers that are usually pretty low paid, are most likely to get infected with COVID-19 because they are the most exposed and they're most likely to have underlying health problems mainly because of their age or gender, but also because of their limited access to other resources. And indeed, this will have a knock-on effect on the wealthier sections of society because their everyday lives will be disrupted to some extent, but at least they have more safety nets that will enable them to cope. So the idea that COVID-19 is non-discriminatory is very much misleading, and the sooner we grasp this point, the sooner we can appreciate that COVID-19 may have actually, unfortunately or fortunately, helped to expose the underlying root causes that lead to differential vulnerability in different sections of society. And so what COVID-19 might therefore highlighted for us is that it underlined the vulnerabilities, emphasized the root causes, and highlighted once again that disasters are never natural.
Thank you, Ksenia. So yeah, I expect a key point here that we risk assessment for cultural heritage, as for any context really, should consider the hazards and threats in a proportionate manner through considering the likelihood and possible consequences of impacts on a range of factors, so on people, on the buildings, on the environment, etc. And that's just good risk management anyway, of which understanding the impacts of COVID-19 will be one of the components, and in some contexts maybe a particularly important one. So it needs to include all those things. One way that, and we don't, we don't think we're not going to prescribe a specific thing that you need to do here, but some things for you to consider. So, for example, through the use of scenarios, which are developed with a range of local stakeholders, where you can ask, what if, for example, there was an epidemic or pandemic going on, and also we experienced a flood, which is something that might happen quite frequently to some of your sites, for example, and then discuss what the issues are and what you can do proactively to actually minimise the negative impacts. Also, as part of that, and the clear message that we need to move away from a focus on single events, so consider multiple compound drivers, consider different stakeholder local community, understand the underlying vulnerabilities which Ksenia has mentioned, and consider how we can adapt, not just using new technologies, but maybe traditional ways of adaptation. So we're coming towards an end. We've mainly talked about the risk management aspect, so it's been a major on risk management, a minor on cultural heritage, but we're going to bring those things together now. We're not going to go into a lot of depth because some of the other talkers in the webinar are going to focus a lot more on the cultural heritage aspects. So I've got the not so fun job of highlighting the challenges of COVID-19 in relation to cultural heritage, and there are clear ones such as financial challenges because of site building closures and loss of business opportunities, and social impacts because people have lost their jobs and their livelihoods, and maybe that has an impact on intangible cultural heritage as well, and potentially political challenges related to funding being diverted, those important regular issues related to flooding or fires, and being diverted to focus on what they perceive as bigger issues such as COVID-19. So there's clearly a lot of challenges. So I'll hand over to Ksenia now to highlight what also there was quite a lot of opportunities.
Indeed, like any disaster, COVID-19 has presented us with some opportunities. Well, first of all, as I said already, it really hopefully made us think about the root causes of vulnerability. And that is an important political step if we are to tackle the kind of status quo in a way that we understand and see disasters. There are also some social opportunities, such as the cultural sites becoming livable again by the locals, and of course we treat that word very, very carefully. And it also allowed and encouraged different cultural heritage sites to think about innovative ways of presenting what it is they have to present, and making therefore cultural heritage much more accessible to those who may have never been able to visit the sites otherwise. Hopefully, there would be some financial gain, for example, as an income from different online events and also remote, virtual, very often activities. In terms of physical impact, we should also think about the less physical impact, tangible impact on cultural heritage, because there won't be as many tourists visiting them, and there may even be a chance for the natural beauty to get reborn.
Thank you, Ksenia. So just to finish off, just to reiterate a couple of key messages. Good multi-hazard management, good disaster risk management considers multi-hazards and multiple threats, which will, of course, in the current climate will include issues such as COVID-19, but it shouldn't only be about COVID-19. It should be about the other issues as well. And also we need to be a little bit more nuanced about understanding the impacts of these different hazards as well. It's not just about cultural heritage, it's not just about buildings, it's not just about livelihoods, it's about all those things together, so that we have a good, rich picture of actually what the impacts are and how to prioritize our interventions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ksenia and Lee, for very eloquently explaining how COVID-19 can be a lens to better understand underlying vulnerabilities that create disaster risks. COVID-19 pandemic concerns should be accurately factored alongside other hazard and treated into risk assessments, and will require risk reduction measures in an integrated manner. There are many challenges and opportunities that we must consider on political, financial, social, physical, and environmental aspects. Thank you. So now I'm pleased to invite our next panelist, Professor Takayuki Okubo, who is a professor at the College of Science and Environmental Engineering, Rethinking University, and director of RDMCH. His current research interests are focused on urban and architectural design for disaster mitigation that promote the utilization of traditional knowledge and wooden materials. He will be reflecting on community based on disaster risk management based on Japanese experiences. Over to you, Takeyuki.
Thank you, Dawon. So, hi everyone. So today, I'd like to explain about technical solution. So towards the post-COVID times. So my specialty is civil engineering and architect, but to build up the disaster risk management plan with local people, we should hold some kind of the communication, like a workshop. So you already know about that. To protect the cultural heritage with surrounding community is very important. So otherwise, we cannot save the culture itself. And for building this kind of a safe and beautiful region with citizen participation is very important. So now this is a purpose of workshop with citizens, experts, and governments. So the first point is share the imagination of on-site damage by various types of disasters. So at first, we need to know what kind of the problem or damage can be occurred on the site. And second point is to discuss on possible countermeasures and emergency responses against the disasters with collaboration of those peoples. So during the discussion, sometimes we can find some ideas for to make measures against damage or mitigation of disasters. And lastly, so we should discuss about who can do that and when should be started at the site. So for this kind of the purposes, sometimes we use the measures on a workshop named Disaster Imagination Game. Shortly, we call just a DIG. In this workshop, we use a huge scaled map and discuss by the groups and what kind of the disasters and what kind of the damage and what kind of the measures can be done using such kind of a huge large scale map. And this photo is a kind of examples in the real disaster imagination game. And this is a workflow of this kind of the workshop. Firstly, so we asked the people to make a small groups by the types of the disaster and so on. And second, we asked them to select some important something, of course, their houses or cultural heritage at the local site and so on. And then we asked them to image the disasters like earthquake. And so we start to draw the many informations and detailed possibilities on the map. And so after, for example, in the case of earthquake, maybe most of the old buildings can be collapsed and some narrow road can be closed and so on. And after that, we ask them to image the firefighting. So where is the water and is a firefight possible? What can we need to do that? And image the sheltering. So does the road is okay or not? And where is the safe space? And what do we need at that times using the huge scale map? And lastly, we asked them to make the brainstorming about issues or some ideas for provisions. But participation of most people is sometimes very difficult because the time is very limited. And for example, in the case of the night times, so young generation, only the young generation can participate. But in the daytimes, most of the elder person only can participate. So as that, we try to develop the tool to name remote dig. But it's developed in 2005, very old, because at that time we tried to solve the problem, which the number of the participants is not so much because of the time limitation or spatial limitations. So as that we try to develop a kind of the map systems which can shared by the peoples on the internet. We just use so HTML word programs, and this is an example. So you can see the base map, and the people can put a kind of photos like this, and they can use the tools to draw the line and or put the comment on the red tag as challenges, or so put the blue tag which shows comments of countermeasures against the challenges like this. And this is a site plan of the experiment of this remote dig held in 2005. So the facilitator and the group participant were stay in the same room. But we developed the server PC and use the main screen, and for individual remote participant, we put the CCTV camera and the TV and connect all of those personal computer in the internet server. And after that, we also try to develop a kind of the game to share the similar experience after the workshop finished. So this is one example, so firefighting game. So you can see the we put you can enjoy I don't know, but you can check how much distance is needed to go for the firefighting from your house, and of course on the map you can see the sign of road blockage and any other damage like debris or flood. In the case of flood, it's water levels, and so as that you can do the route check game for firefighting, and you can understand how the firefighting is difficult in the scene of the disasters like earthquake. And this is another game, so night evacuation games. So of course, most of the disasters not only occur in daytimes. In the case of earthquake, in night times, maybe most of the people cannot move easily. And so as that, we try to simulate this kind of the situations using this game. So you can see the base map, and here is a park as an evacuation space. But in night times, the site scope is very limited. So as that you can check the time and the distance to go through those mazes to the final destination as a safe space. So it's a kind of the time trial game for evacuation in night times. So after this experiment, so we find that the remote the system could remove the spatial restriction of participants, and experiment games were developed for understand the actual situation with some enjoyment. But for individual participants, detailed tutorials are needed for ad hoc participation, because on times we can show the and share the information on time, but ad hoc for the ad hoc participants, we need some kind of the detailed tutorials. And a more easy user interface is very important because some of the elder person is not so good at use internet and the systems. And lastly, so system update is needed for compatibility to recent operation systems and PC, because the original system is developed in 2005. So we should update. And lastly, so I'd like to discuss about the application for our international training course for future in post-COVID-19 world. So remote participation from worldwide and the free discussion on network and ad hoc participation later on is a good point of these systems. But we should think about how to share the detailed site conditions. So in most cases, those kind of the workshop should be held after the town watching or town walking. But if we should share this information in the world, the point is very important. Now, how to facilitate or read and control is also a very important point to solve this free discussion on network. And lastly, so how to leave the footprint, saying to on-time participant. So to solve the time gap, so we should share those information and using the ad hoc information systems. But still now, so that is not completed, so as that we should update this system. And of course, nowadays we can use this Zoom systems or Skype and so on, so as that we hopefully so to arrange these systems into the new platform in these recent times. So thank you very much for your attention. It's over.
Thank you so much, Takeyuki. What a great example that provides us with practical and innovative thinking. Thanks again, Takeyuki. Takeyuki, in his presentation, has illustrated why community-based planning is important, as we cannot reduce the risk to cultural heritage without the collaboration of surrounding communities. Remote DIG is a great idea, as it can be an effective communication and discussion tool for communities during this period of social distancing due to COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, before we moving to next presentation, I would like to remind all the audiences can post the questions to panelists. So please can post the questions to panelists. Okay, now I have the pleasure to requesting Professor Yoshifumi Satofuka, who is a professor at the College of Science and Environmental Engineering, Ritsumeikan University, and he is also the director at the research organization of Science and Technology Frontier Research Center for Natural Disaster Mitigation. His research has largely focused on watershed management, and he will be presenting to us challenges and solutions for addressing climate change. Over to you, Yoshifumi.
Yeah, thank you. So, I would like to start my presentation. Just a moment. Okay, this. So, can you see this? Okay.
Yes, we can see your presentation.
Yeah. So, please see these figures. And this figure shows rainfall events, very strong rainfall event in Japan for more than longer than 100 years. There is very, how to say, the increasing prevalence of the rainfall events. For example, this figure shows stronger than 50 millimeter per hour rainfall event increase in this 100 years. Next. So this table shows a number of victims recent heavy rain disasters in Japan from 2011 to last year. So you can say it's about 100 people every year were killed by typhoon or rainy season front. And this year, this night, also maybe some big disaster occur in Kyushu Island because more than 250 millimeter rainfall event will occur in this night. And for example, 2011, a big typhoon Taras attacked this area in Japan. There is a very famous shrine in Kii Peninsula, Nachi Shrine. So in this case, Nachi Shrine was damaged by debris flow caused by this typhoon rainfall event. And also the 2013 typhoon attacked the Kyoto area. You can see this figure. Some of them, some of you understand. We in Kyoto and some under subway we have. So this railway filled by water, by flood, inundated flood. And also this Yuragawa River is a north flows in north part of Kyoto. Big scale inundation occurred. And this figure is a photo of the Katsuragawa River in Kyoto City. So in this case, the dam is very effective to control the flood discharge. So not so big damage occur in Kyoto. But if there are no dams, maybe some big damage occurred in Kyoto City. And prediction of the climate change in near future, the IPCC said that in this from this 19th to now, the average temperature is about 0.4 degree increase from 19,000 to this year. But in near future, next, so please see, the end of the 20th century, and the average global temperature will rise about 0.3 to 4.8 degrees. So this depends on the scenarios. So average global ocean level will rise, and so 0.82 meter. And the very, very serious rainfall event increase, storm surge damage increase. And so we have to, the Japanese government decided adaptation policy of facilities to flood control. For example, the maintenance of the anti-flood pond and flood control facilities underground retention basin. And also they decided to expand the flood control capacity by raising the existing dams. But such, and also flow, rainwater retention systems and the permeation of the rainfall, we have to increase. And but unfortunately, there is a financial limit to make a new hardware measure. Therefore, it is necessary to enhance software measures. So you can see this figure, this is a typical hazard map. So this figure shows how deep inundation occur in this area in severe serious rainfall event. And such hazard map is depend on the new techniques. We use this radar system to measure the rainfall event in very, very accurate. And also we need a new calculation simulation method simulation software to calculate the flood inundations. And please see, evacuation system for flood is needs such kind systems, accurate rainfall forecast and hazard map based on the inundation prediction, and the preparation for the evacuation plan and setting up shelters. It supports people requiring assistance during a disaster, and operation of shelters, recovery after the disaster. So these three factors is strongly affected by COVID-19. So each local government is proceeding to this software countermeasure, but it's sometimes very difficult. At first, shelters need more larger space, and we need to keep, because we need to keep distance even in the shelter. In the past evacuation plans, each local government has created its own plan by themselves. But in the future, it is necessary for multiple local governments to cooperate with each other to create the wider area evacuation plan. It is only way to secure the evacuation space. So ITC, I would like to suggest for ITC training course, hazard maps based on inundation prediction. So it needs a two-dimensional flow simulation. So recently, especially in Japan, free simulators for calculates flow inundation, flood inundation. That is easy to use for Professor Okubo said user interface is the most important to have for the user. So this simulator has a user interface. It's rather very easy to use. So I would like to show and introduce such kind of the Japanese free systems, simulation systems for you in near future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Yoshifumi. Based on climate change monitoring report in Japan, you likely mentioned that the risk of floods are increasing. And through your presentation, you also explained to us how floods and landslides are impacting cultural heritage in Japan. Therefore, we can mitigate risks by adopting appropriate disaster risk management policies and maintain flood control facilities and protection tools. It is also necessary to enhance software measures which educate and encourage citizens to properly evacuate in the situation of flood disaster, and this issue needs special consideration at present due to limitations posed by current pandemic. Thank you, Shihumi, again. So now may I invite Jo King, a director of Partnership and Communication Unit, acting focal point, finance and administration at ICROM. And he will be discussing the roles and activities of international organizations working in the field of cultural heritage sector. Over to you, Joe.
Okay. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
okay,
we can hear you clearly.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I seem to be a little bit dark. I apologize for that. So first of all, I would like to thank very much Rethinking University for their partnership on this webinar, and also our longer term partnership in the implementation of the International Training Course on Disaster Risk Management for Cultural Heritage. This partnership is marking its 15th year in 2020, and this is an important activity for ICROM. And I would actually also like to take this moment to recognize the sort of the brains behind the creation of this course, and that is Professor Kenzo Toki, who was very instrumental in starting this initiative up, and it's now going on 15 years, as I said. At this particular moment with COVID-19, we are in a particularly difficult moment, but also I think an important moment for us, given that the nature of this crisis is pointing to us for the need to perhaps rethink and reshape the course in order to take into account the lessons that we are learning in the present time. And this, of course, leads directly to the theme of my intervention today, which is how should international organizations working in the field of cultural heritage rethink activities in the light of COVID-19. In order to answer this question, it is first important to distinguish between the different types of intergovernmental organizations and their role in conservation of cultural heritage. The web of international organizations is diverse, and each organization has its own scope and its own place within the larger system. For example, ICOMOS and ICOM are international NGOs, non-governmental organizations, which serve as professional networks to bring together professionals from first at the national level in regard to their national committees, and then from around the world for their international activities. ICOMOS, as many of you know, takes a strong lead in contributing to the establishment of professional practice through its now long list of international charters. And it would be interesting to know that if the Disaster Risk Committee at ICOMOS may be trying to take some of the lessons learned here toward future doctrinal texts to be issued eventually by ICOMOS. Other organizations such as the World Bank and other international development agencies also partner with national and local governments and other organizations on project implementation and development. Whereas intergovernmental organizations such as UNESCO and ICROM, who work directly with member states on cultural heritage issues. But even we have differences between us, as UNESCO tends to focus more on putting forward international norms and conventions for heritage conservation. For example, the World Heritage Convention or the Intangible Heritage Convention, while ICROM focuses more on capacity building and on technical issues related to conservation. I would also take this opportunity to mention universities within this context, within this list. While it is true that universities are not technically international, in recent years, there has been a push in many universities to include a stronger component of international students, making them important actors, both in education and training, as well as research at the international level. And in fact, Rethinking University is an example of that, and the ITC international training course is a good example of that, bringing together people from around the world. I do want to emphasize, however, that one thing the international organizations are not is we are not the heritage police. It is important to remember that direct responsibility for cultural heritage and its conservation rests with national and local governments, and also more and more with local communities and with people. The international system is set up to help foster collaboration and cooperation, but it is not set up to police conservation activities. That role, as I said, rests with national and local actors, but it surprises me sometimes how often ICROM gets emails asking us if we can force or if we can intervene with a local government to safeguard a particular heritage site or a particular heritage building. Of course, we work with local communities and we work with the authorities when we're invited to, but even within the World Heritage Convention, if you look at the decisions that the World Heritage Committee makes, the World Heritage Committee usually invites states parties to take a certain conservation action. They're not acting as a policeman. The international system is a cooperation mechanism, and I think it's important for everyone listening to us today to recognize it for what it is. So, what can we do at the international level, and how has COVID-19 then affected the work that we are doing? Well, if I look at the various strands of activities that are being carried out at the international level, these include setting professional standards and methodologies, promoting and carrying out research, developing tools and resource materials, and especially for ECROM and capacity building. So how has COVID-19 and the crisis that we are living through right now changed what it is that we do? Well, this webinar is already one example. Most of our focus on disaster risk management in the past has been related to physical well-being of both communities and their heritage. But this crisis has made us realize that well-being is not just limited to physical comfort, but it is also related to mental health and mental well-being. And it is linked to the tangible heritage, and it is also linked to the intangible heritage. This crisis has provided us with a push to move more into the digital world and the virtual world to ensure that everyone stays connected and everyone gets the information that they need. In its simplest forms, this includes the plethora of virtual tours of both museums and sites that are now popping up all over the internet. And more directly at the professional level, it is the abundance of webinars, such as the one that you are listening to right now, which are providing new information and keeping people connected and informed. For years now at ECROM, we've been talking about the need to increase our distance learning opportunities, and we have done so on occasion in the past. But this crisis has really pushed us to quickly confront this issue and to try to move forward in a very purposeful manner right now, in a very quick manner right now. And this webinar is an example of that. But we've actually also started at ECROM another regular online lecture series, and the first series of those lectures within that series have been related to the pandemic and have been organized to a certain extent by our program on first aid and resilience in times of crisis. So this COVID-19 pandemic is leading us to the idea of reaching out to the virtual world in a more strong way. But I do want to caution against over-enthusiasm for the virtual. I would argue that a virtual tour of the Roman Colosseum or the Kyoto World Heritage Sites or the Louvre Museum will not actually replace going there in person and experiencing things in person. The same is true for training. Some training can be easily done online, and the crisis is showing the way forward. But some things do not adapt themselves particularly to online, and we should not pretend that online experiences will substitute for longer-term hands-on capacity building and training. And that includes benefits of hands-on training, and it also includes benefits of actually being in the same place at the same time for a period of time to get to know your colleagues and to share experiences in a more informal manner. And these sorts of webinars will never be able to substitute for those. So while we can do certain things online, we also have to recognize its limits. And in fact, in this context, I would also talk about the idea of digital documentation of heritage. Things such as laser scanning and drone photography are certainly incredibly useful for conservation and incredibly useful for sharing information over longer distances, let's say. But they do not substitute for the need to conserve the original object and its and the original places in their authenticity. So I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. In terms of content, the pandemic has obviously also made us realize that we have not been paying attention to biological hazards very strongly in the past. This is an area of our work that needs strengthening, and I imagine that we will be including that much more strongly in future international training courses. We also, and this has already been mentioned by Lee and Ksenia before, we also have to focus much more on complex emergencies. During this pandemic, we have already had cyclones in India and Bangladesh. Just a few days ago, we had an earthquake in Mexico City. And one could even make an argument that you can characterize the demonstrations that are currently taking place in the United States as contributing to complex emergencies. So we have to think about what impacts COVID has on emergencies, but if we're going to deal with an earthquake and we have to think about keeping distance, keeping social distance to also protect from COVID, we actually have to incorporate those kinds of ideas into our training and into our planning. In relation to the demonstrations in the United States right now, those are not physical issues, but there we're looking at issues related to revaluation of the heritage, revaluing our heritage, and that also creates a complex emergency or a complex situation, a complex thing that we need to think about, where we're looking at the needs of the pandemic, but we're also looking at the needs of revaluing our heritage and bringing our discussions to the communities more often and getting feedback from the communities. And in fact, ECROM's people-centered approaches, I think, goes a certain way toward doing that. So I think that's something that we also need to be looking at more. We have, of course, we've been talking about this issue of complex emergencies at ECROM for some time now with our FAR program, but I think we really do need to look at this more as we move forward with the ITC and in other venues. The pandemic will also force us to expand our target audiences, both in terms of participants in activities and also partners in activities. So we need to take a look at a wider slice of disaster risk management professionals. We already are talking to humanitarian agencies and civil defense, but we also have to look more at medical and health professionals, and we need to look at ways of incorporating issues related to biological hazards into our coursework and bring those partners into the planning of courses in addition to just being participants in those courses. The COVID-19 pandemic is certainly going to force us to think in new ways and with new people, but I want to close with one final thought related to recovery efforts. One of the things that I would argue that we are very bad at in the international world is focusing on long-term recovery efforts. We respond to crises pretty well, but then our attention gets distracted as the next crisis hits, and we don't necessarily devote the necessary time and resources to long-term recovery. So I would very much hope that this will not be the case with the pandemic, and it is my sincere hope that in other complex emergencies in the future, that we will learn the lessons that we need to and make sure that we invest the necessary time and the necessary money in the long-term recovery efforts. So I think that's really one of the things that we need to be moving on to in the international community in the near future. And I'm very much hoping that my colleagues at ECROM, my colleagues at UNESCO, but in all the other international organizations will come together and think about longer term recovery efforts. With that, I would like to turn the floor back over to the host, and I would like to thank everyone for having taken the time to listen this afternoon.
Thanks, Joe, for a very insightful presentation. You nicely explained the important role of international organizations in creating tools, disseminating knowledge and capacity at various levels. This needs rethinking in the light of limitations posed by the pandemic and fresh insights for the future. In post-COVID times, international organizations need to find ways of communicating with diverse professionals from various sectors such as heritage, disaster risk management, urban development, besides decision makers and even politicians. The international training course on disaster risk management presents us with the unique possibility of linking international organizations, professionals, and decision makers. So now, may I request Rohit to moderate the discussion by posing questions received from the audiences for our panelists. So over to you, Rohit.
Thank you very much, Devon. So before I just pose, we have received many very nice questions from our audience. I'll take a few of them because of limited time. But just before that, let me just summarize very interesting presentations made by our panelists. And I will just go quickly. I think one of the key points that came up was that we need to look at biohazards, but not in isolation. We need to consider both rare events with high impact as well as frequent events with low impacts. COVID-19 was rightly pointed out is a lens to better understand underlying vulnerabilities. Need to consider digital technology for creating virtual platforms for tools such as disaster imagination game that seeks to engage diverse sections of community. We also need to think of mainstreaming climate change and disaster risk management of cultural heritage. And preparedness measures need to take into consideration special requirements of social distancing and hygiene during epidemics. And also, an important point that came up was the importance of refocusing new ways of communication, dissemination, capacity building, developing tools and methodologies by international organizations. So I'll just now ask a few questions to our panelists. So may I request all the panelists to just turn on their camera so everyone can see. Thank you very much. So the first question I have is for Lee and Ksenia. Uh, you have pointed out an importance of underlying vulnerabilities. What kind of systemic changes can be made in order to address the vulnerability issues for those communities who are very intimately connected to cultural heritage? For example, artisans, craftsmen, or those who are, maybe engaged in the management of the sites. So if you can tell a bit more on how we can refocus a bit more to address the challenges faced by this section of community. So may I request Lee, and please.
Do you want
Do you want me? Do you want me to go first, Ksenia?
Yeah. Great minds. Yeah. Simultaneous question. Well, it's a difficult question, right? I think, to me, the answer, first of all, we need to understand what the systemic challenges are and the systemic problems are, not from the perspective of our privilege, or I think this is the challenge you experience, but actually through engaging with the communities that are so closely, whose livelihoods are related to cultural heritage. And to understand not just the challenges, but also their strengths, in order, to try and understand how the strengths can actually contribute to systemic changes. It's not easy. Just providing more economic resources, for example, or making site more accessible wouldn't solve the problem, because the systemic changes are the changes that system needs to make. And what the system wants is, well, it's a neoliberal system that we experience now. So the system wants profit, right? The system kind of doesn't really care for lives. I think we've seen this quite a lot in the COVID. So yeah, to understand what their livelihoods depend on and how that can be supported, I suppose, through their livelihoods, through those people and their strengths is one way to do it.
Yeah, just to very briefly follow up on that, this is where cultural heritage actually can play a really important part, because it can make people actually value the livelihoods that may otherwise be undervalued. And what's important in doing that is, hopefully, it will give possibly sections of society who have been marginalised or who have been undervalued more of a voice. So part of what we need to do, and this does take time, is to make sure that there are mechanisms put in place to actually listen to and to communicate and let these communities actually be part of not just decision making, but actually how the issues are framed, so that we do move away. And this goes back to one of our slides earlier. It's like that there's an assumption that some of these frequent low impact events are low impact events, but actually for some sections of society, they might be major impacts. So which keeps them in those sort of highly vulnerable status. So putting mechanisms in place through the work that you do, involving representatives of those communities in understanding what the issues are, and then helping to come up with solutions and ideas which are appropriate for their needs as well, is important.
Thank you very much for answering this query, Lee and Ksenia. So the next question is for Professor Kubo. So Professor Kubo, the question is, you explained how we can use digital technology for disaster imagination game, and you explained how it can be very useful. So can you give some other examples or any other ideas on other kind of tools that we can develop which can help us in disaster risk management, or maintenance or monitoring using these new digital media or communication tools available?
Okay, so thank you very much for your question, and it's also very difficult. But maybe so at least I believe various types of virtual reality systems can be used to make a research or to understand the actual situations without go to the actual site. So because of the pandemic, we should keep the social distance, and we should take care for go outside. But if we can develop the detailed virtual reality systems, then so we can make the research about the risk or actual conditions and so on. But for example, so before the disaster imagination game, we need to go to the town watching or town walking to pick up some information about the risk or some value of culture. For the situations, those kind of the recorded digital image should be very useful. But I believe that so some kind of the interactive information sharing with the local people is also very important. So as that we should understand the limitation of those digital technologies and to utilize at most for future. Was it okay?
Thank you very much, Professor Gobo. So the next question is for Professor Satofuka. Professor Satofuka, there's a question for you about, can you please explain different parameters which should be considered while designing evacuation routes, considering this special situation? If you can throw some light on that. Thank you. Can we unmute, please? Yes, you are muted. Can you unmute? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Mm. Please explain about the question, final phase.
Okay, so the question is like, how can we really do a kind of special consideration for evacuation for these kind of situations? Like you can we have some parameters? Can we have some special considerations?
Yeah. So in the evacuation, through the evacuation, so the parameter is not so changed. Yeah. So usual, we can use the same parameters, but
Okay.
because on the route, the situation is so each citizens have can keep the same situations even in the COVID, but only in the shelter that space is limited. I think so.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. So there is this interesting comment made, and the comment is made by Mr. Rashmin saying that for the group and this discussion, it might be interesting to know of the impact of increased compound risks that were actually mentioned by Ksenia and Lee related to Oaxaca, Mexico earthquake that just struck. Where more than 20 hospitals were damaged. And similarly, Cyclone Harold in Vanuatu had an impact on shelters during COVID-19. So there is also needs to be a balance between COVID-19 transmission and economic recovery. And I believe that cultural heritage sites, including religious sites, could also be a hotspot for transmission, especially in Latin American countries. So we have to see, from that perspective as well. So I have the next question for Mr. King. So Joe, The question is, don't you think those opportunities and changes into digital sources may also represent some sort of risk to certain heritage as they may be abandoned or less cared for? So how do you address that kind of risk?
Well, I think yes. I think there are potential issues there for sure. But you know, every generation passes down to the next generation those things that it considers to be the most valuable. And so we're always, if I understood the question correctly, I mean, we're always revaluing our heritage in one way or another, and we're choosing what we're passing down to the next generation. I mean, that's what the World Heritage List is supposed to be all about, is that the international community is coming together and it's valuing certain heritage in a certain way, and it's passing it to the next generation. But these sorts of let's say reinterpretation or rethinking, I think, is a natural part of what we do. Yes, that does create certain risks, and I think, you know, as I said, we in the international community, what we should be doing is we should be working to foster cooperation and communication, and trying to figure out ways to make sure that everyone has a voice and that everyone can express themselves, and that solutions are found that, as much as possible, meet the various needs of the various, interested parties, let's say. And I think that is actually probably the most important role that we in the international community can play, is allowing for that discussion to happen in a neutral place, if you will, and moving forward in a positive way. And I think that's, again, if just going back to Ikram's people-centered approaches, that's the whole people-centered approaches is based on that concept, that we need to be providing a place for this dialogue and for differing communities with differing values, with differing viewpoints, can come together in a positive way rather than in a negative way.
Thank you very much. There's a good suggestion here that is it possible to work out general guidelines by cooperating with World Health Organization to educate workers in the management of cultural heritage to confront biological hazards? There is also one interesting comment, which is really a challenge that is posed. If the detailed data related to potential hazards is less, as it, for example, on debris flows, especially in many developing countries, how to make mitigation in those countries effective in the absence of adequate data. So anybody would like to answer that question? Yes, Lee.
If I may have just it's a very good question. I don't think we should use lack of data, though, as a reason not to take mitigating actions. One thing that I've learned in looking at disaster risk management and trying to understand the prevalence of natural hazards in the last 20 or so years is actually we already know quite a lot of information, even by talking to local communities and even reading maps and looking at where there's shrines and memorials and things like that. So data, of course, is very important and is in some means considered to be essential to make more informed decisions. But where you do have a lack of data, don't use that as a reason to not actually understand what the prevailing hazard profile is. Also taking into consideration that maybe some areas that have had moderate impacts from floods and storms and things may actually be on the increase due to the impacts of climate change. So my suggestion would be to is sort of consider the worst case scenario and consider the historic events, but perhaps consider also that they may be in the case of getting worse. So yeah, and ideally if you can get data, then that's great. There are increasing the amount of low-cost monitoring equipment for landslides and flood risk management and Raspberry Shake-based seismometers and things like that. So there is information out there, is data collection mechanisms out there which can be increasingly more affordable, but don't use a lack of data as an excuse not to do something.
Thank you. Professor Sadhusuka, maybe we can have your comment as well. please.
Yeah, so I show the hazard map. So it needs accurate data about the topography and rainfall data. But usually in developing country, it is very difficult. In my laboratory from Afghanistan, some students came to my laboratory and studies about the flood prediction in their country, in Afghanistan, but there are no data. So in such case, they use satellite data. Japanese government can give them freely. So such kind of the international collaboration to support is sometimes useful to make they use in developed country. I think so.
Thank you very much, Professor Suzufuka. So I'll just make the last comment, which is just come in. It is about the importance. I mean, there is a concern that in many developing countries, there is really lack of professionals who are able to understand issues and address them. So there needs to be much more capacity building needed, not only at the global level, but also at the national and the regional level, to tailor to the specific requirements of those places. So I think that's very important comment, and this is the reason why Ritsumeikan University and ECROM is continuing to do this capacity building activity for last 15 years, because we see that there is more and more need to do this and for different regions in the world. So I will now thank you very much again to all the attendees for such useful questions and comments, and also to the panelists. Now I pass the floor to Swan for concluding remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rohit. This is a wonderful discussion that we could discuss about how can you deal with the situation of the COVID-19 for the field of disaster mitigation for the cultural heritage. So I would like to once again express great gratitude to all the panelists and also our organizing team here at RDMUCH and ECROM that has been working hard to bring these webinars to you under this extraordinary circumstance. We also thank all the attendees for participating and giving us really good questions, comments in the webinar and raising important questions. The recorded version of this webinar and proceeding will be available on RDMH and ECROM website. I also take this opportunity to announce next webinar, Rethinking Disaster Response and Recovery, held as part of this series on 4th July, 6 p.m. Japanese Standard Time, which is 11 a.m. Central European Time. Please don't miss it. So thank you for being with us. Wishing you great health. Goodbye.
Bye.